Welcome to the Today's Leader podcast, the podcast for the leaders and entrepreneurs of today.
Way to go, guys. Way to go. Keep it going. Good job, guys. All right, Paul, I see you. All right, Tom, finish on. Coach Cole.
Hey there, it's Coach Cole here, and welcome to episode 328 of the Today's Leader podcast, the podcast for the leaders and the entrepreneurs of today. Now, the world of leadership is a constantly evolving space, and it's incredibly challenging for leaders. We've seen the disruption of COVID. We've seen continuing emergence of technology, and that increases in pace. So with everything that's going on around us, it's often hard to navigate our way through. And the problem that we face is often ourselves. So what does this mean for you? And how can we shuffle our way through this maze that we continue to confront? Now, our guest today will endeavour to provide the answers. Jeff Nischwitz is known as the snow globe shaker. Yep, you heard me right. The snow globe shaker, shaking things up. And he's on a mission to help people shift how they lead and thereby shift their leadership impact. He's an international speaker and personal transformational coach. He's known for his unique perspectives. He challenges traditional thinking and delivers tangible shifts for leaders to grow their people, build their business, and enhance their relationships. Now, Jeff is the founder of the Nischwitz Group, a speaking, consulting, and coaching company that transforms people and organizations one truth at a time. He also co-hosts the Leadership Junkies podcast. Jeff has also published 4 leadership and business books, including his most recent, Just One Step Walking Backwards to the Present on the Camino Trail. He's also currently working on his next book, which is, funnily enough, called Snow Globe Leadership, Shaken, Not Settled, which he aims to publish in 2021. Please welcome Jeff Nischwitz to the podcast.
The podcast is brought to you by Think and Grow Business, the home of the Think and Grow Business Mastermind. If you're serious about growing your business, get serious and join a mastermind group today. Find out more at thinkandgrowbusiness.com.au.
It's my pleasure to welcome to the Today's Leader podcast. I have Jeff Nischwitz. Jeff, how are you?
Doing wonderful, Tony. Doing wonderful today.
And I can imagine it's been a beautiful day in Florida. It's a very cold and chilly morning here in Brisbane, Australia. So, and once again, one of the amazing things about technology and podcasts is you get to speak to people right around the world. So Jeff, let's start with the really simple question. Tell us the Jeff Nischwitz story.
Well, I'll do my best to make it brief. I've had so much practice in this. I'm a I consider it fully recovered lawyer or solicitor, depending on what nation you're in. I did that I say fully recovered because I practiced law for 17 years, and now I've been doing something else for 19 years. So okay. I figure once you cross over, when you've done something else longer, you've really left that behind. Learned a lot. One of the big lessons I learned in that is you can be really good at something, and it's not what you're supposed to do.
Yeah.
And that's what I found with the law, and so I left the law and went on a journey. And today when people say, Jeff, how did you go from being a lawyer to being this coach and speaker and, helping people go deep in their journey? I said, well, I'd love to tell you it was a great plan, brilliantly executed, but it was more like a car wreck.
Yeah.
And I was traveling at a high rate of speed, as I usually do, thought it was the right direction. The vehicle and the driver left the highway, flipped a few times. Car and driver were damaged, but the car was drivable, the driver was functional, and I drove in that direction it was pointing. And that is, I'll tell you, probably a lot closer to the truth than anything about some grand plan or vision.
I reckon there's so many people listening right now that are resonating with that story. It says so much about who we are and what we do that sometimes it just takes that train crash, car crash, whatever we want to call it, to get us actually moving in the right direction. So Jeff, you're known as, now correct me if I've got the terminology wrong, the snow globe shaker. I'm intrigued. I am fundamentally intrigued about this concept of snow globe leadership. So talk me through that.
Well, I certainly find it fascinating, and I will tell you it's been memorable for others. What happened was about 5 years ago, I was speaking in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I didn't own a snow globe at the time. To my knowledge, I didn't own a snow globe. But on stage, I started thinking about snow globes. And I don't know how much speaking you do, Tony, but I've just learned to trust. And I found myself talking about snow globes. And what's evolved is this idea that snow globes are meant for one thing. When you get down to it, they're meant to be shaken. Yes, they look pretty and they're unique to the place, but they're meant to be shaken. And I started realizing in talking to people that most snow globes are never shaken. And the reason is because they're good enough as they are. They're pretty, they look nice, so people put them on a shelf. And I thought, well, isn't that how leadership is and how culture is and how our lives are, that what we really need is some disruption, some shaking up, because that's the magic. But it's nice enough as it is. And even when we shake things up, and a lot of this is about internal disruption. I want to be clear. It's about shaking up my thinking, my actions. But even if I shake up the snow globe and myself, as soon as I stop shaking, everything immediately starts to settle. And that's what happens. So we settle with a retreat. We have this retreat, talk about new ideas, nothing changes. Or we try something new for a week or two and we don't stick with it. So the whole metaphor is that we need to constantly shake things up, starting with ourselves.
Yeah.
And that when we shake it up, most critically, we have to make some shifts. So I say we got to shake and shift. And the shifts are, how do we see things, how do we perceive things, and how do we act? And that, to me, is what leadership is about, whether you're leading a team, an organization, or your own life. So I'm all about shaking it up, Tony.
So when you shake up the snow globe, it's very rare that the pieces would settle back in the exact same spot that they were. So I can certainly see that analogy. I mean, one of the compelling thoughts that came to my head when you were speaking there, Jeff, was a leadership workshop I did with one of the organisations that I was with here in Australia, and we used to talk about steering the ship and rocking the boat. So we'd steer the ship. So as a leader, part of our role was to steer the ship and rock the boat. So really agitate against the concept of status quo. We're really focused on how do we challenge the status quo. We don't want to settle. We want to be the best. We want to keep growing. And so I can see some real alignment in between what you talk about with the snow globe leadership. How do people respond when you talk to them and say, we're going to talk leadership and we're going to talk snow globes?
Well, I'll tell you, initially they go, what? And then they quickly get it. And I think they get it because it's visual and because they can all relate to it. I will tell you, Tony, the first time I started sharing it was at a large, not sure if you're familiar with the National Speakers Association. And you meet a lot of people there, and they all ask, what do you do? And what do you speak on? So I said, I speak on leadership and snow globes. And I would be walking by people 6 days later, and they would all say, hey, you're the snow globe guy. So it's memorable because it's different, but what's more important is people really connect to this idea of the need to disrupt and how easy it is to settle for good enough.
Yeah.
That piece, and I will tell you, the interesting thing over the last 18 months is I started to get pushback, and I love pushback. It's a chance for me to learn and to disrupt even more. And the pushback was, Jeff, I've been disrupted enough during COVID. I don't really want more disruption. I said, that's where you're wrong. Because what's really critical is when we're being disrupted externally by things we don't control, it's even more important that we do the internal disruption and fundamentally change how we're leading, how we're showing up, how we're seeing things. Because if we do things the same way and the world shook us, you're going to just get smashed against the glass.
So how do you use the concept of snow globe leadership with leadership teams or organizations?
You really just use it as a visual reminder, the metaphor, so people can get the idea of shaking things up. But then you have to get at, to your point, Tony, you said once you shake up a snow globe, the snowflakes or the sparkles, they go in different places, but it doesn't look different inside because the core part is solid, right? It's not changeable.
Yeah.
But that's where we have to do it differently. We have to start changing something fundamentally in how we see things and how we act. And a lot of this, and I know a lot of your guests talk about, what does it mean to be more conscious as a leader? And what does it mean to be more impactful? So I'll give you a quick example. Just 2 days ago, I was with a team. We were doing a team session, and we were talking about the importance of focusing on impact conversations, not behavior conversations. And what that means is most people, when they talk about what people are doing, we focus on the doing. You did this, you didn't do this, you said this, you didn't say this. And we focus on the behavior, and then we start judging the person for it. So if you don't communicate with me, I'm going to say, you didn't communicate with me, you're a poor communicator.
Yeah.
So behavior judgment. But the real important conversation is for me to share with you how your behavior impacted me. You know, when you didn't communicate with me, the impact is I'm wondering if you don't trust me. My job got more difficult. I wasn't able to report out to someone else, so their job got impacted. We weren't able to meet a client expectation. We were slow in our service because I believe that impact is all that matters. We want to have intentional impact and minimize our unintended impact. But we've got to talk about that impact. And if you've got a team member who doesn't care about the impact they're having on you, we've got a much bigger issue.
Yeah.
So focusing on impact starts revealing what's really going on with our team. Is it a behavioral issue or is it a core value issue?
Yeah.
So that's an example. That to me is a fundamental shakeup of how we look at communication and leadership right there.
Communication is just one of those things that, and once again, I'm just trying to put this into context for myself. So focusing on impact should fundamentally improve the communication channels within an organization when you're looking at a greater aspect outside of behaviors. So communication is one of those biggest things that I see within the biggest challenges organizations face. Is that the only benefit, or is that one of the key areas that you focus in when you're talking about snow globe leadership?
It's one of the areas is communication, but the most important thing probably 95% of what I talk about in shifts in leadership relate to trust. Because what I believe is the issues in organizations and team, no matter what the surface issues are, it's a trust issue.
Yeah.
It's a fundamentally trust issue. We assume trust when we shouldn't. We're not intentional about trust. We're not intentional about earning trust, making sure we're not breaking it, being honest with someone if I've got a trust issue with them. You know, if I've got an issue with you and you're on my team, it's vital that I have a conversation with you to just say that. You know, right now, I'm not able to trust that you're going to deliver on what you said. If I don't have that conversation, then we just keep dancing around each other. So if we can address trust, now we address culture, now we address performance, execution, the client or customer experience, we address engagement. But most of what I'm talking about are shifts that help us be better and more intentional and more conscious about what we're doing with trust.
I saw a report recently, Jeff, that says trust continues to decline in the world, especially when we're talking about our leadership, our political leadership. We're talking about being a population that's becoming more and more cynical, more and more distrusting. So in the context, and I agree with you 100%, trust is the foundation of everything that's great in your life. It's not just what's great in the workplace. If you don't have trust within your personal relationships, that personal relationship will always be that walking on eggshells around each other, which it is not a good place to be. So when you look at leadership today and the organizations that you're working with and the leaders at various levels, what are your thoughts around where we sit and let's use a common phrase, the state of leadership? How would you describe the state of leadership today?
I think it's a mess. I think that if you look at leadership today, we don't see much of it. And I think we've lost sight of what leadership is. And if I want to simplify this, leadership to me is 90% plus about people. It's about people, and it's about growing people, and it's about growing a team, and it's about growing the people around you. Yet so many leaders today are not giving any time and energy to that. They're not. They're focused on, and leaders tell me this regularly. They say, I know I need to spend more time with my people, but I don't have time. So, well, what are you doing? Because that's actually your job as a leader. What's all the stuff you're doing? And there's a lot of stuff that's happening. People are doing stuff, but it's about people. It's about being present. It's about listening. It's about understanding. It's about vulnerability. It's about empathy. The world has shifted, and it's not about millennials or other generations, but there's been a fundamental shift in the workforce. And it shifted again during COVID. Around the world, you've got this workforce that suddenly got a taste of what remote work looks like. And companies today are bringing people back to the office, and people are rebelling. I don't know if you've seen these numbers, Tony, but in April in the U.S., 4 million people voluntarily quit their jobs.
Wow.
That's an unheard of number. It's never been that high.
Yeah.
So people are quitting their work for what? Probably quality of life or a better opportunity. The other data is they're saying 35 to 40% of the workers in the U.S. plan to get a new job by the end of the year of 2021.
Yeah.
Why are they leaving? Well, I think there's one of two reasons. One is they're either leaving because of the experience they had during COVID, or they're leaving because the experience they're about to have because what the company's doing or not doing well coming out of COVID. And, I tell leaders this for months. If you led the same way the last 18 months you did the years before that, you probably failed.
Yeah.
And if you keep leading the same way, you're going to fail because the world has so fundamentally shifted. The workforce, their mindset has shifted. And I think a lot of this had changed already. I think COVID just shone a brighter light on it, frankly.
Yeah, it's just really accelerated a lot of the changes that we're seeing. And I see a lot of leaders that I work with really struggling with the concept of, the hybrid workplace. I've spoken about this so many times that during COVID 2020, it's almost like they told themselves that I can do this for a short period of time. And then all of a sudden, when it starts to eke into the permanency of the workforce, there's been a real shift in some of the leaders that I work with and their mindset, and almost like they've been going back to medieval times in the quest of control. I need control back, and because their team are being productive, they are performing, they are doing all these things in the at home. But some of the leaders are fundamentally feeling like they're divorced. So how do you work with a leader to shift that?
That's a big challenge, but I will say this. Most of this comes down to helping leaders identify their blind spots, if they're open to it. And also understanding that once they identify a blind spot, they have to take some different action to close that gap. And then there'll probably be a new blind spot. We all have blind spots, but that takes some humility, some vulnerability to admit that. And I think I'm working on a new book right now, and I wrote a chapter just last week about blind spots. And I realized that the biggest blind spot it comes from some arrogance, but that we already think we're there. I had a guest on my podcast last year who's a leadership coach, and he said, if you talk to 100 leaders, 95% of them are going to say they're a servant leader. But the truth is only 10 or 15% are. But they already believe they are. So if you already think you've arrived, what are you going to work on? And that's where leaders have to be willing to hear what their people are saying and be willing to be open to a perspective. This is why it comes back to impact. Because you can't deny your impact.
Yeah.
You can deny it. You can say, I didn't intend it. But when you see you're having an impact, even if it's unintended, are you willing to take ownership of that? And that's a big part of what I work with leaders on, is having them take personal responsibility for the impact they create, even if they didn't intend it. Even if they didn't intend it. Because if a leader's not willing to be open to the fact that they don't know everything, which seems obvious and simple, but if you're not willing to be open to that, then nothing's going to change.
Yeah.
And do you care enough about your people to really look at yourself in the mirror and get honest? And that's scary stuff, because if you look at all the surveys of leaders, their top fears are making a mistake, seeming like I don't have all the answers, and coming across as lacking confidence. So their response to compensate for that is to think they act like they have all the answers, not listen well, and to come across as overconfident and not open.
No one likes to look bad, in inverted commas. And sometimes, I mean, that's the real key to being vulnerable with your team. I mean, I still remember, Jeff, in the early days of my leadership career, we had a new manager come in to take over the store. And, you know, one of the first things he said, I may not have all the answers, but between us, we do. And I just thought that is so powerful for me to hear that from a manager, that he's not going to stand here and say, I've got this, I know it all. But it was really, and providing encouragement and hope that the team were going to be part of the resurrection of this particular store. So I can certainly understand everything that you're saying there. A leader doesn't want to look bad. They put up facades. I think a lot of them work in this bluster and bullshit sort of scenario, where they just continue to steamroll through and hope no one notices. But the fundamental thing that's happening is their team are noticing, and their team pick it up first. And that's one thing that a leader really needs to understand. If you've got faults and failings, your team already know about it. So all you're doing by admitting it is confirming their thoughts, but it's putting you in a better light with them, because at least you're opening up that conversation. So,
well, it's kind of funny you bring that up, because as you said that, Tony, I was thinking about years ago, I attended a men's retreat that I'm now heavily involved in the organization. I lead them now. And one of the things we talk about is when people come through this retreat, it's very emotional, very intense. And they go home and they go, what am I supposed to tell my partner about this? Like, I don't even know where to begin. And we typically, what we tell them is, tell them this. Tell them you learned some things about yourself that your partner probably already knew. And that's so true in leadership. Like, if a leader could just step in front of the group and say, you know, I learned something about myself today, but you all probably already know that. And then share that, the power of that, the trust that gets accelerated through that. And people, here's the bottom line, people follow people voluntarily for one reason: they trust them. Yeah. They trust them.
Yeah. You can almost hear the collective word of the team saying, finally. Finally, they're admitting it. Yeah.
And now, what are you going to do about it? Because claiming it is not enough. You have to show a commitment to change.
Absolutely. And otherwise you just, what's that old saying? Doing the same thing, getting the same results. So what are the keys, do you think, to better leadership? Or I'll use some of the language that you use, more impactful leadership. So what are the keys that you see that can help leaders really become more impactful?
Well, we've touched on a number of them already. The big one, which is the scary one, it's the elephant in the room, although it's not hiding anymore, and it's vulnerability. You know, if you think about this idea of vulnerability, in order for me to model vulnerability with my team, I have to be willing to be internally vulnerable. And vulnerability is just about taking a risk. I mean, there is a risk. If there was no risk, it wouldn't be leadership. It would just be following the, painting by the numbers.
Yeah.
So vulnerability is key, but a big part of that is reframing vulnerability because I wrote a chapter for the new book the other day, and I said something like, we've got to take the emotion out of vulnerability because too many people think vulnerability is just about being emotional, but it's not. Vulnerability to me is just taking the risk of being human. I don't have all the answers. I made a mistake. I'm not sure. Here's an act of vulnerability. Asking questions is vulnerability. Making statements is not vulnerable. I'm going to tell you what I think. I'm going to tell you what to do. That's not vulnerable. But asking questions, seeking to understand is vulnerable. So a big one is vulnerability.
Yeah.
Another one is really committing to showing up differently around trust. We talked about that. The third one is genuinely committing through action to becoming more self-aware. Because if you can't lead anyone better than you can lead yourself.
Yeah.
And if you're not willing to understand yourself and dig in here and go inside and take a look at the parts that aren't so shiny in order to grow them, to be more conscious, to go from unconscious to conscious. And I think that the last one that hits me is, we talked earlier about impact, and it just to me is like this river that runs through leadership. Some of my favorite questions are talking to people, asking that question, what was your intended impact? And what might have been your unintended impact? Because we just have all these people impacts. And I think the final one, which we could talk a long time about, is just simply bringing more humanity to leadership, to humanize leadership, to understand that you are leading people. People are humans. You're a human. They're having a human experience, and they're looking for a place that they feel safe, not just productive. They want to feel safe. We can talk about psychological safety, a culture of safety. I think organizations today, and this is where I get the big vision.
Yeah.
I believe that organizations and leaders today can not only create a place where their people are not worse off because of work, but their mental health is actually better because of work.
Yeah.
You've got 8 to 10 hours a day with people. That's the biggest part of their life when you take out sleep. What if organizations created a culture of safety where people felt included, they felt like they belonged, they felt cared about, they felt like they mattered, they were seen and heard? It transforms the organizations, but more importantly, it transforms the planet.
Yeah.
And if that's too big a vision, I'd like to go big.
Yeah. It's a worthwhile vision. I was thinking to myself to ask you, part of that, I suppose we've all got a little bit of cynicism in it. But the concept of utopia is pretty much what you were describing there from a work performance aspect. But what I was thinking as well, Jeff, is that the good organisations already get this, and they're already working in this sort of space, and they're keeping their teams mentally well, physically well. They've got that balance happening in life. They've built really strong trust, and their performance is indicative of that. Whereas the organisations that don't get it are the ones that are still being really, really challenged in so many ways. So if you're a leader out there, I would suggest that you start looking into how you can, what's your role in creating that sort of an environment. And I work with a lot of middle level leaders, Jeff, and one of their constant frustrations, I guess, is that everything gets driven from the top. It all starts from the chair. And I still try and just get them focused on, well, what can you control? What can you control? And what's your role with your team? And how can you create this sort of an environment? So,
I agree with that. I think one of the biggest opportunities today is for people to set aside the idea that change comes from the top.
Yeah.
It's not true. Permission comes from the top.
Yeah.
Permission
Okay.
comes from the top. But what the changes we're talking about, they don't require permission. They don't require budget. And any person can start to shift how they're interacting with other people around them, how they're managing, how they're leading wherever they are. And that can build up. You can transform the culture one person at a time. You really can. But there's a risk because you got to show up differently.
Yeah.
And you risk someone saying, "Why are you doing it that way?" And you got to be willing to stand for something. But that's what leaders do. Leaders take risks. They stand up for what they believe in, and they take bold action, even if they don't have permission.
Yeah.
We need more
Making a
rebels and
difference.
outlaws, is what I think.
Rebelleadership.com.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a business name, but anyway. Hey, so who's inspired you in your leadership journey, Jeff?
It's such a fascinating question because, you get to ask that a lot. And the surprising answer after all these years, I've been working for 37 years.
Yeah.
And what I've learned is that the person who taught me the most about leadership is my dad.
Yeah.
And he got a lot of things wrong, too. It's not about getting it all right. But I've learned about humility. I've learned about passion. I've learned about caring about people. I've learned about, healthy sacrifice. So there's so much that I learned from my dad close up as his son, watching him in his own business, and then becoming even closer to him over the years. And grateful for me, he's still alive. Another person I would say who I've gotten to know the last 5 years is a guy named Walt Rakowicz. Walt was the CEO of a company called Prologis. Walt just came out with his first book last year called Transfluence. But Walt's just one of the most humble leaders I've ever met. And he resurrected that company from very dark times with vulnerability, transparency, putting your people first. He's a guy that walks the talk, and I follow people who walk their talk. So Walt
Excellent.
and my dad come to mind.
What are some of the traits? So I always like to think about the leaders of today or today's leaders. How do they differ from the leaders in the past? So what are some of the traits that you would see for today's leader that they must have?
There's quite a few, and I think you hit the nail on the head there. That what's happened is the world has changed, the workforces have changed, and one of the challenges is we have so many leaders today, no matter what their age, but they were led by people who were then led by people who were leading 30 years ago.
Yeah.
So what's required today, a lot of people have never seen modeled. And that's a challenge because it means the risk goes up. So better listeners, better questioners, a commitment to doing your own personal work around self-awareness and self-honesty, doing whatever work you need to do to find that place of vulnerability, empathy, and really understanding empathy. And people regularly say to me, you got to be careful not to be too empathetic. I said, I disagree completely. I don't believe you can be too empathetic. I believe you can be too sympathetic.
Yeah.
Empathy just means I understand and I really can appreciate someone's situation. Why do I want to be why could I be too much of that?
Yeah.
But the key is I can be empathetic and still hold boundaries. But that's where the personal work comes in, because the reason most of us don't set boundaries is because we don't think we're worthy of the boundaries. We believe that we have to be all things to all people, and we have to have everybody like us, and everybody's got to think that we're the best person. When being the best person is about really empathetically caring about someone. And I would say this, I listed some traits, but the mindset that comes to me most often, Tony, is genuinely and practically putting your people first.
Yeah.
A lot of people say they do, but I could watch them for 24 hours and say, nope, because their actions don't show it.
Yeah.
The reality is people are waiting to be seen, heard, and valued, and to feel like they matter. And in order to do that, you got to put your people first. And really believe that when you do that, you'll get the outcomes you want. And I'll close with this. I just said it about an hour ago. I've never said it before, so no one's heard this before. What came out of my mouth was this. A lot of people think, including leaders, that we have to perform in order to serve. But that's backwards, because what we need to do is we need to serve in order to perform. When we're in service, we create performance outcomes that are greater than anything we imagined. But we got caught in a trap from the last 50 years that said we've got to focus on execution and performance because that's how we serve others. Yeah. No, we serve others, and that service creates cultures and trust and relationships that drive the performance we're desiring.
Powerful. So, Jeff, tell me about your relationship with failure. All of our journeys have ups and downs, and you've shifted from being a very good lawyer or in the law industry and then taking a shift. So tell me about how you how do you feel when whether you fail or are about to fail? Walk me through that relationship.
Well, I've learned a lot about that, and it took a lot of not just hard knocks but slap downs. You remember I talked at the beginning about that car wreck. Well, that primary car wreck happened in about 2003 or 4, because I had stopped practicing law, I had started a new business, and I was convinced that I could not fail. I mean, I had had a very successful career in law business. Thought I'm the guy. And 3 years later, I was out of business. But here's the key. It took me 5 years to admit that I was the reason I was out of business. For 5 years, I told a story to everyone, including myself. And the interesting thing about the story is the story was factually true. The elements were true.
Yeah.
But it wasn't the truth. And in September of about 2009, I was asked to speak to a group of entrepreneurs, and for the first time I stood in front of that audience and said, let me tell you why my business failed. You're looking at him. I was arrogant. I thought I knew everything. I thought all I had to do was show up. I didn't do the work. And as a result, I suffered a significant business loss, financial crisis that humbled me. And the key is we're all going to fail. That doesn't mean we're failures. We're all going to fail. The question is, what do we do with that? What do we learn? There's so many versions. I like the one that says it doesn't matter how many times you get knocked down. The question is, do you keep getting up, and do you get back up with something? That's the learning.
Yeah.
And I had to be humble enough to acknowledge that I was the fault. I was the failure in it. But it didn't make me a failure. Now I've come full circle. I still hesitate sometimes. I would be naive to say I don't. But I take risk, I fail, I learn. I'm constantly looking to say, okay, this didn't work out this way I planned. What do I need to learn from this?
Yeah.
I feel like I've come so far because I embrace failure, and that is a trait that leaders need more of. Because I don't know about you, but what I find is every leader I've ever met says I learned the most from failure. But when you ask whether their organization has a culture where it's safe to fail, the answer is no.
Yeah. And the other thing that comes into play, Jeff, is when you fail, you don't tend to look your best. So that concept of a leader not wanting to look bad also comes into the concept of embracing and learning from failure. And so instead of trying something new, they'll stick with something that's tried, tested, maybe the status quo. And just so that they can appear to look good as opposed to actually fundamentally going out and changing what it is that they do. So you're writing a new book. You've talked about a couple of books. What's the book that's had the biggest impact on you?
Wow. That's a challenging question because I read so much. I'll tell you, the one that's probably had the most wide sweeping impact is a book called Man's Search for Meaning.
Okay.
By Viktor Frankl.
Yeah.
A Holocaust survivor, a psychologist, a researcher after the war. He did survive it. Because if I could summarize his perspective on it, he basically says that no matter what happens to us, we always have a choice of our perspective on it.
Yeah.
And if I look at everything in my life, my business, my relationships, my personal journey, just my day-to-day living, the recognition and the trust that I always have a choice is so empowering to me. It's so I never feel like a victim. I don't feel out of control. I feel in control because I've got those choices, and I choose to focus on what I control, which is me. So Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, is probably the most profound impact in a book for me.
Excellent. And I think that one of the biggest challenges that we face at the moment is that the world, to me, is really divisive, it's disruptive, and I think that ability for us to not to react. I mean, we see so many emotional reactions on the news, on the social media channels, wherever you look, there's someone reacting with emotion. And that ability to be more resilient and choosing our response to be, once again, let's talk about an outcome, to get a productive outcome, is something that's in many ways missing in the world today. So if that book can help anyone navigate their way through some of that, you've done the job in mentioning it. So is there anything that I haven't asked you that I should have asked you, Jeff?
I love that question. I often ask people that one as well. I love that question.
I think it's in the podcaster's top 10 questions to ask.
What's the question I didn't ask, and what's the answer? So I guess the way I would frame the question is, if someone could do one thing better, just one, what would have the most impact on their leadership, personally and professionally? And I would say, start to understand and practice what it means to be present. Yeah. My ability today to be really present in the moment, most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, it's my secret sauce. It allows me to be a better coach, a better speaker, a better listener. It allows me to navigate the challenges and chaos we have in our life. That's not going to change. To navigate in a really good way the emotions of what was the pandemic and everything else that's going on. So if you want to be more powerful in a really healthy way, and you want to have little or no stress, and you want to have more of an impact, learn what it means to be really present and start to really hone in on the practice of presence.
And once again, just sound advice. I was actually listening to one of your podcasts yesterday where you were talking about being present. So obviously it's something that's really critical for yourself, and it's critical for all leaders out there, because in so many ways we think we're being present, but fundamentally we're not, because we're potentially thinking about everything else that's got to be doing. And I think that's one of the really powerful gifts that you can give to people in your team, to be fully present when they need you. And I once again, I think that gets rewarded. I think that gets recognized, and you build loyalty, you build commitment, you build performance. So Jeff, how can people connect with you? I'm sure that there's going to be people listening to this that say, I need to hear more from this man and want to talk to him. So how can people connect with you?
Well, thankfully, I have a really funky last name, so it's really easy. If you can spell my last name, which is Nischwitz. If you search Jeff Nischwitz, there's no one else out there that's on social media. You can find my website, which is the nischwitzgroup.com. You'll find me on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. You can get access to my newsletter. I do daily videos that I started during COVID. That was one of my shakeups. But yeah, I would love to have people reach out for a conversation, because I just love learning what people think, and I love people challenging. Let's have some challenging conversations, because we get better through those conversations. I learned what's that? I forget where it is. I think it's a biblical reference. Iron sharpens iron. So I love having some iron in my life.
Yeah, absolutely, Jeff. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to have you on the Today's Leader podcast. Thank you so much for investing your time in Today's Leaders.
Thank you for having me, Tony. It was my pleasure.
Join the group of people impacted by seriously simple stuff to get you unstuck. The first book by Tony Coach Curl. Available at Amazon, Tony's Simple Stuff provides the tool for people to master your life and aspirations. 20% of every book sold supports Carter's cause.
And now, it's time for Tony's 2 cents.
Jeff spoke about trust during our chat and how integral it is for leaders to build and maintain trust in their own leadership makeup. Now, the problem that is being faced in the world is a continuation of rising levels of mistrust. And many leaders simply assume that their team, their staff, the people that follow them, trust them. Now, assumption of trust without the conscious behaviours from the leader that authentically build trust is a major problem for leaders. Assuming people trust you because you have a title is dangerous. You are assuming or believing something that isn't built on any foundation. Great leaders know and understand that trust is built from authentic behaviours, initially designed to connect and build rapport with others. And that's my 2 cents. A big thank you to Jeff for coming on the Today's Leader podcast and for investing in today's leaders. Now is the time for you to take control of your leadership growth in this disruptive world we navigate. Our aim is to help you become the best leader you need to be today by providing you access to global leaders and experts. If you're looking to build better leadership skills, check out the Today's Leader website at todaysleader.com.au. Today's Leader is a collective mindset, being the best leader today, forging greater success tomorrow. The mindset to make a difference, the ability to create an impact. Think and Grow Business hosts our Today's Leader Masterminds, Think and Grow Business, where we focus on personal, professional and business growth. Book your free 30-minute discovery call at thinkandgrowbusiness.com.au. Don't forget, you are standing stronger, braver and wiser. Don't forget the golden rule. You know what it is. Don't be an arsehole. I'll see you all again next week. Bye for now.